Imagine waking up to find your peace shattered, not by burglars or vandals, but by the very people who are supposed to protect your community. One morning, I discovered that my HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were targeting me. Petty warnings turned into outrageous fines, and then something happened on my own driveway that left me speechless. I thought I knew what abuse of power looked like until this. What do you do when the people in charge of your neighborhood become your biggest threat? For years, life in my neighborhood had been quiet and predictable, the kind of place where families waved from their porches, kids rode bikes down the cul-de-sac, and everyone seemed content to keep to themselves. I bought my home here because I thought it was the kind of community where you could finally breathe, put down roots, and focus on the little joys of life. At first, that's exactly what it felt like. Weekends were spent tending to my yard, carefully planting flowers by the walkway and keeping the lawn trim and neat. I'd saved for years to buy this house, and every time I pulled into the driveway, I felt a sense of pride. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine. It was supposed to be my safe space, a home I could protect and cherish. Neighbors would pass by with polite smiles, sometimes commenting on how nice the garden looked or how quickly I'd settled in. I made an effort to stay on good terms with everyone. I wasn't looking for drama, and I certainly wasn't looking for conflict. Like most people, I assumed the homeowners association existed to keep the neighborhood orderly and well-kept. A nuisance at times, maybe, but nothing more than a group ensuring standards were maintained. But slowly, the cracks began to show. It started with letters in my mailbox, little notices about minor violations. At first, I brushed them off. A flower bed that didn't match the neighborhood's aesthetic. A trash can left out on collection day a few hours too long. Small things that felt more nitpicky than serious. Still, I complied. I didn't want to make waves. The notices kept coming. Each one sharper than the last, and always signed off by the HOA board. It was as if someone had decided to single me out, watching every detail of my property with a magnifying glass. And with each notice, I felt a shift. A sense that the peace I thought I'd bought into wasn't as stable as I believed. What unsettled me most wasn't just the letters themselves, but the way my neighbors seemed to avoid eye contact as I pulled into the driveway. The same people who once complimented my garden now barely nodded as they passed. It felt coordinated, as if I'd been quietly marked, set apart from the rest of the community. At night, I'd sit on my porch and stare at the identical rows of homes around me, wondering how something so picture-perfect could feel so suffocating. I tried to convince myself it was just overthinking, that maybe this was just how HOAs operated. But deep down, I knew something was shifting. And then, one morning, I walked outside and realized it wasn't just letters anymore. The conflict was moving from paper into real life, onto my driveway, my property, and eventually into every corner of the life I'd tried so hard to build. The first few violation letters had been irritating but manageable. I'd pay the small fines, adjust what they asked, and move on. At the time, I told myself it was better to comply than to make enemies. But that approach only seemed to fuel them. Instead of backing off, the HOA ramped up their scrutiny, like a predator sensing weakness. Soon, I was receiving letters weekly, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single envelope. Each one was more ridiculous than the last. They fined me because the shade of mulch in my flower bed wasn't approved. They fined me because a garden hose was coiled on the side of the house, visible from the street. They even fined me because the number on my mailbox, which had been there since the house was built, was not reflective enough under evening street lights. At first I laughed. Who could possibly take something like mailbox paint seriously? But the fines weren't a joke. They stacked up fast, turning into hundreds of dollars, then thousands. And worse than the money was the principle. It wasn't about maintaining order, it was about control. I decided to attend one of the HOA meetings to defend myself, thinking maybe if I showed up in person, explained, and demonstrated that I was reasonable, they'd back down. That was the night I realized I wasn't dealing with neighbors. I was dealing with power-hungry bullies hiding behind bylaws. The board sat at the front of the room like they were presiding over a courtroom. I presented my case calmly, pointing out that none of their rules specifically prohibited what they were fining me for. But they didn't care. They smirked, whispered to each other, and then dismissed me with a vote. No discussion, no fairness, just a swift, unanimous ruling against me. Walking out of that meeting, I felt a mix of humiliation and rage. My neighbors had watched the entire exchange, and no one spoke up. Some wouldn't even look at me. It was as though I'd been branded, the outsider, the troublemaker, the one to keep quiet about if you didn't want to become the next target. From that point forward, the harassment escalated. I'd wake up to find anonymous notes taped to my door, criticizing my lawn or mocking the fines. I'd catch people slowing their cars as they passed my house, watching me like hawks. And every time I fixed one so-called violation, another would pop up. It was a game I could never win. Then things turned from annoying to personal. One morning, I walked outside to find tire tracks tearing across my front yard. The grass I had spent months carefully cultivating was shredded into muddy ruts. There was no note, no explanation, but I didn't need one. The tracks were deliberate, not accidental, and they cut straight through the middle of my property. I reported it, of course, but the HOA's response was chilling. They blamed me. In their letter, they claimed my yard had not been sufficiently protected against damage and warned me that if I didn't take corrective action, further fines would be issued. My yard had been vandalized, and instead of investigating, they used it as another opportunity to punish me. That was the moment I realized the HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were actively targeting me. And if I didn't fight back, they were going to bury me under their power. I tried contacting other neighbors to see if anyone else had been through this. Most shut me down quickly, afraid to talk. But one older gentleman on the corner finally admitted that years ago he too had been singled out. He'd tried to push back, but eventually gave up and sold his house at a loss just to escape. "They pick one person every few years," he whispered, "and they don't stop until they break you." His words haunted me. Was that their plan? To force me out, to make an example of me? If so, they underestimated just how stubborn I could be. I began documenting everything, every letter, every fine, every petty demand. I kept a binder full of evidence, complete with timestamps, photos, and witness notes. My plan was simple. If they wanted a war, I'd fight back with proof. But before I could even put my strategy into action, the conflict took another shocking turn. One morning, I walked outside to head to work only to stop dead in my tracks. My car, my brand new car, barely a year old, had been smashed. The windshield was spiderwebbed with cracks, the side panels dented, and a long, deliberate key scratch ran from the headlights all the way to the trunk. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't random. It was personal. I stood there frozen, heart pounding as the reality sank in. Someone had come onto my property, targeted my car, and destroyed it in the middle of the night. I called the police, of course. They took the report, but without cameras or witnesses, there wasn't much they could do. But when I reported the incident to the HOA, hoping for support or at least acknowledgement, their response left me speechless. They blamed me, again. Their letter accused me of failing to secure my vehicle in a manner consistent with community safety standards. As if I'd invited the vandalism, as if my car being smashed was just another violation. That was the breaking point. Up until then, I'd tried to comply, to play their game, to stay within the lines. But when they turned my victimization into yet another excuse to punish me, something inside me snapped. I was done being passive. I was done letting them control me, and that's when I began planning my revenge. But here's the thing, revenge against an HOA isn't like dealing with a single person. It's a machine. You can't just fight it head-on. You have to be smart, strategic, and patient. So I kept quiet. I paid the fines I had to, smiled when I passed board members, and pretended like they were winning. All the while, I was gathering evidence, preparing my move. And then one night, they handed me the perfect opportunity. Because when the same HOA member who had been harassing me parked her car illegally on community property, right in front of my driveway, I knew exactly what I was going to do. When I saw her car parked illegally on the edge of my driveway, half blocking the curb, tires cutting into the grass she'd fined me for, I almost laughed. The same HOA board member who had slapped me with violations for a trash can being out too long, for a hose coiled in plain sight, for mulch that wasn't approved. She had done something blatantly against the very rules she used to punish me. It was the kind of hypocrisy you couldn't script. And for me, it was the crack in their armor I had been waiting for. At first, I considered letting it slide. Maybe it was a mistake, maybe she had just been careless. But then I noticed the detail that made my blood run hot. She had parked directly in front of the "No Parking a Fire Lane" sign. A sign the HOA itself had erected. A violation that was supposed to result in immediate towing. I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and dialed the tow company. The man on the other end asked for the address, the location, and the details. "You're sure it's in violation?" he asked. My eyes locked on the sign, and I didn't hesitate. "I'm absolutely sure," I said. When the tow truck arrived, I stood at my window, heart pounding as if I were about to commit a crime. The driver hooked her car up in silence, winching it onto the flatbed. The metallic clank of the chains echoed through the quiet neighborhood. It was the sound of justice, loud, undeniable, permanent. As the truck pulled away with her shiny SUV in tow, I felt a surge of satisfaction so sharp it was almost dizzying. For months I had been their victim, their scapegoat, their punching bag. But in that moment I had turned the tables. I hadn't broken the rules. I had enforced them, but I knew it wouldn't end there. The next morning, the chaos began. I was barely awake when I heard the banging on my front door. I opened it to find her standing there, face red, eyes blazing. She didn't speak at first, she screamed. She accused me of setting her up, of sabotaging her, of humiliating her in front of the entire neighborhood. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply held up my phone, where I had recorded the tow truck pulling away, the "No Parking" sign glowing under the streetlight just a few feet from her bumper. The truth was undeniable. She froze. For the first time, I saw her lose control. Not of me, but of herself. And then she stormed off, slamming my door so hard the frame rattled. By that evening, the HOA had called an emergency meeting. Word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered, texted, speculated. Everyone knew what it was about. The board wanted blood, and I was the target. Walking into that meeting was like stepping into an arena. Every seat was filled, every eye on me. At the front, the board sat stiff and furious, their leader glaring down at me with thinly veiled hatred. They launched into accusations immediately. They said I had acted out of spite, that I had weaponized the rules, that I had created unnecessary division in the community. They claimed the tow had embarrassed the board, undermined their authority. But this time, I wasn't on the defensive. I stood calmly, binder in hand, the same binder I had been building for months. Page after page of documented harassment, fines, violations, letters, and photos. I laid it all out. The absurdity of the rules, the targeting, the vandalism, the sticker on my door, and now, the blatant hypocrisy of their own board member parking in a fire lane. Every word I spoke was measured, but each one hit like a hammer. "This isn't about me," I said, scanning the room. "It's about power. They enforce rules when it benefits them and ignore them when it doesn't. If they can do this to me, they can do it to any one of you." There was a silence that hung heavy in the air, thicker than any I had felt before. For the first time, I saw heads nodding, not in judgment of me, but in agreement. People were listening. People were questioning. The board tried to shut me down, cutting me off, declaring me out of order. But every interruption only made them look weaker, more desperate. By the time I finished, the tide in that room had shifted. I could feel it. Then came the moment I'll never forget. A neighbor, someone who had never so much as waved to me before, stood up and said loudly, "He's right." Another voice joined in. Then another. People who had been silent for months, too afraid to speak, suddenly found their voices. They began sharing their own stories of unfair treatment, of petty fines, of intimidation. The room that had once been a place of isolation for me had transformed into a chorus of resistance. The board panicked. Their faces turned pale, their authority crumbling before their eyes. And for once, I wasn't the one being silenced. They were. The climax wasn't just my car being smashed, or even their SUV being towed. It was this moment, the shift from isolation to solidarity. For months, they had tried to make me the example, but now they were the ones exposed. Their power, once absolute, was being dismantled right in front of them. I left that meeting with my hands trembling, not from fear this time, but from adrenaline. For the first time, I felt vindicated. For the first time, I realized the HOA wasn't invincible. But even as I walked out into the night air, a strange calm washing over me, I knew it wasn't over. They weren't going to give up their power easily. They weren't going to forget the humiliation, and I wasn't going to stop until I saw this through to the very end. Walking out of that emergency HOA meeting, I could feel the shift in the air. For the first time in months, I wasn't alone. The same neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now nodded at me, some even whispering encouragement. It wasn't just my fight anymore. It had become a crack in the facade of the HOA's power. But if I thought that single meeting was the end of it, I was wrong. The board wasn't going to give up quietly. They doubled down, sending me more fines, more threats, more letters filled with legal jargon designed to intimidate. They even threatened to put a lien on my home if I didn't pay the growing stack of penalties. That was their final card, the nuclear option. And in a way, I was grateful they played it, because it gave me the leverage I needed to take the fight out of their hands and into a place they couldn't control, the courtroom. I hired an attorney, armed with the binder of evidence I had been building for months. Every letter, every fine, every photo, every absurd accusation, it was all there. My lawyer was stunned by the sheer volume of documentation. "This isn't enforcement," he said, flipping through the binder. "This is harassment. We filed a lawsuit, not just to defend against the lien, but to expose the pattern of abuse, selective enforcement, and targeted harassment. And when the HOA realized I wasn't bluffing, that I was prepared to drag their actions into public record, their bravado began to crumble. Depositions were taken. Board members were forced to answer uncomfortable questions under oath. My lawyer played clips from the meeting I had recorded, showing their attempts to silence me, contrasted against my calm presentation of facts. Neighbors submitted sworn statements, confirming their own experiences of petty harassment. Piece by piece, the narrative shifted from me being the troublemaker to the HOA being the aggressors. The trial didn't last long. When faced with overwhelming evidence, the HOA's attorney tried to settle. They offered to drop all fines, remove the lien threat, and even pay for the damage to my car and yard. But it was too late for half measures. I wanted accountability. I wanted the truth on record. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. The HOA had acted in bad faith, had selectively enforced rules, and had engaged in harassment. They were ordered to reimburse me,